Good evening.
Yeah.
Hello. Oh, yeah, great. Good evening. Welcome to tonight's lecture. My name is Ashley Bigham. I'm assistant professor in architecture at the Knowlton School. And before introducing tonight's speaker, I want to also take this opportunity while I have the microphone to remind everyone of the two remaining Baumer Lectures that we have upcoming in this semester. So next week, next Wednesday, we'll have Oleg Drozdov and Irina Matsevko, who will be traveling to us from Ukraine. And they'll focus on their work as architect and historian, respectively, and they'll share their ongoing work with the Kharkiv School of Architecture, which positions architecture as a form of collective resistance in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In our final lecture, which will be happening on April 10th, will feature Lefevre Fellow Samia Meme, and it will also celebrate the opening of her exhibition called Girl Room, which has some amazing posters I've seen around school. And that will be in the the lecture will be here, but the gallery opening immediately following the lecture will be in the Banvard Gallery, so please plan on joining us at those events as well. And I think that this exciting series of semester-ending lectures perhaps begins tonight with our speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce Phu Hoang. So following Phu's presentation of his work tonight, there'll also be a short discussion led by Professor of Architecture Ann Pendleton-Julian, and also time for audience questions, so please stick around for that. And to our speaker, Phu Hoang is head of the architecture section here at the Knowlton School and Robert S. Livesey Professor of Architecture. Before joining the Knowlton School 2 years ago, he taught at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University and also has taught at Harvard Graduate School of Design. Phu Hoang is the founding director of the interdisciplinary architecture practice MODU, founded with Rachely Rotem. Together, they have published a new book, which is the topic of tonight's lecture, I believe. And the book is titled Field Guide to Indoor Urbanism, which in their words, calls for a shift in environmental thinking, designing for exchanges between architecture and the city that are both outside in and inside out. And the concept of indoor urbanism merges the opposing scales of urbanism and interiors, prompting architecture's borders to recede, end quote. Central to their inquiry are three major metropolises on disparate continents: New York, Rome, and Tokyo. Within the vibrant environs of these cities, MODU embarks on a journey of discovery, unearthing the intricate connections between built form and natural context. Their research and design projects serve as theoretical insights and as blueprints for transformative actions. The practice is designed for numerous cultural institutions, including Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, Art Basel Miami Beach, Design Museum Holon, and Creative Time. Along with his co-director, Phu was awarded the Founders Rome Prize in Architecture. They have also been awarded the Emerging Voices Prize from the Architectural League of New York, the U.S.-Japan Creative Artists Fellowship, and the National Endowment for the Arts, from the National Endowment for the Arts, and also research grants from the New York State Council of Arts and the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, as well as many other design awards, some of which have been awarded recently for their project in Texas. In his built work, writing, and pedagogy, Phu embraces the complexities of the urban experience, charting a path toward new understandings of climate, from micro to macro, and in the exciting possibilities of everything in between. So please join me in welcoming Phu Hoang.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi. So often I'm giving the introduction. It's a little bit different to be here and giving the Baumer Lecture. Thank you so much, Ashley, for the introduction and generous comments. And in advance, thank you to Anne for having a conversation. As I mentioned, I'm typically not the one who's giving the Baumer Lecture. As the section head here, I do want to give my thanks. This is a typical slide you see at the end. I And this theme of starting at the end is something that I'll talk about a little bit more, but give thanks certainly to the faculty it's their dedication here in this school that makes Knowlton Architecture in particular a design school. And this is not something that I take very lightly. I think that not all schools are design schools, and it's really special to be the head in a school in which it is. A school that combines speculation with this very difficult task of asking questions. Certainly thank you to all the students for taking on this engagement and practicing this idea that design is an act of extreme optimism, especially with everything that's going on in the world. And very importantly, thank you to all the staff, which makes Knowlton a place that we want to spend so much of our time in. This is a theme on indoor urbanism. As Ashley mentioned, I'm one of the two founding directors, Rachely Rotem and I, of MODU, which is an interdisciplinary practice at the intersection of design, ecology, and urban data. We're a design practice that conducts research. We always consider it to be design-led research. Sometimes the research precedes design, other times it follows it. So I'm going to give a few examples of it tonight. Indoor urbanism is a research concept that we developed and guides a lot of our work. Architecture, we see architecture at the middle scale, in between the two extreme scales of the built environment, between the interior and between the urban, it resides architecture. And in looking at architecture beyond its boundaries, we imagine an architecture with fewer borders, one in which we try not to reinforce the environmental and social inequities that come from the borders between these spaces. This is the color blue, which is obvious. This color is representative of the sky, of the water, of the environment, but it's also the color of our book, exactly this Pantone color. The word for the color blue we have always found very interesting is that in ancient language, there was no word blue. For a long time, they thought that perhaps the DNA of human eye at the time could not see the color blue, but in actuality they didn't have a word for it. So ancient Greek and Roman and Chinese and Japanese languages, none of them have a word for the color blue. It's often the same word for blue and green, sometimes for blue and black. So we call this invisible blue, and it's really what we do as architects. We render visible the invisible. We give form to the immaterial, and at MODU, the invisible are the microclimates. The material is the threshold. The visible is the weather, the invisible is the climate. This is the beginning of our book. We begin with a glossary. These lexicon terms are the representation of an idea. They're hybrids that synthesize architecture and the environment. It's really the language of our practice. We've developed these words over different projects, over teaching, over research. And so collectively, it's the collection of them that matter. It's not about any individual term, but the 50 of them together are the multiple concepts that define indoor urbanism. And like the color blue, these ideas need to be made visible in order to begin designing with them or for them. And what we're trying to argue for is an idea of architecture and the environment that are extensions of each other, not as an either or, but a both and on a kind of continuum. And the terms themselves, they seem like contradictions often that defy categories. They don't fit neatly into any boundaries that are architectural or social or environmental, but they actually cross across these categories. Rachely and I are both immigrants, and for both of us, English came as our second language. My first language was Vietnamese, which is read from left to right. Rachely's is Hebrew, which is read from right to left. These terms can be read from left to right and from right to left, and it guides a lot of our thinking because when you read it in different orders, it actually allows for misinterpretations and misreadings, which we find very productive in how we develop our work and our research. This is a pretty well-known image of the Buckminster Fuller's proposal for a dome over Midtown Manhattan. The proposal was to cover Midtown with a technological enclosure, which would be a massive reduction of the energy use because the minimal surface of the dome was less than all of the vertical surfaces of the building envelopes that were housed within it. It's a utopian project. It's one about imagining an urban environment that has no weather. Fuller would describe this as a one-way vision, shatterproof glass misplated with aluminum. This aluminum would reflect the solar heat away from the dome. This drawing is a drawing for an exhibit that we participated in at the Storefront for Art and Architecture. It's a retroactive future that imagines the eventual completion of the dome, where living inside the dome was a constant temperature without seasons and without time. But this came as a price. It would heat all the areas around it because of its reflective materials. Now, living outside the dome was a city of differentiated microclimates, with weather based on the climate and the distance from the dome. This is a city that we want to live in. It's a city that questions the modernist project and its ideal of separating architecture from the environment. These are the front and rear covers of our book, which was designed by incredible graphic designer MGMT Design, also and published by H.J. Kantz. These covers include the project that I just showed, as it is important to us, as well as you can look at it from front to back and back to front. So this, I usually in these lectures, this is usually at the point when I would speak about the proof or the kind of evidence of climate crisis. It's unfortunate, but I no longer feel I need to say this. It's absolutely undeniable. Climate migrations, which are both social and environmental, are transforming our cities and our countryside, and very much drastically. So New York City is no longer a humid continental zone. It's now humid subtropical. But this doesn't really mean much because it's too abstract. It's not empirical to understand these different classifications. It's perhaps more important to understand that New York in 2050 will have the climate of Washington, D.C., the climate of Savannah, and Savannah that of Miami. But even that is something that is changing, and that perhaps it's not 2050, but now it's 2040, and perhaps even 2030. Modernism's technologies, especially centralized air conditioning, but also the curtain wall, double glazing, disconnected architecture from its environmental project. Before that, the environment was squarely within the discipline of architecture. We're trying to break this modernist cycle of making borders disappear visually, but reinforce them environmentally. After all, 40% of the carbon emissions in the world are from the built environment. So air conditioning, as a principle, works by moving heat on the inside to the outside, which then heats the outside air around the building, and then begins this kind of never-ending cycle. The interiors, architecture, and the city are all a continuum that we see connected by the environment. The term the environment exists in both the indoors and the outdoors. And we're trying not to reinforce the wall, but actually to thicken it at times or to thin it, make it into a threshold space that can be occupied, which is for us both an architectural and an environmental project. After all, our bodies are thermodynamic systems, and the more thermal diversity that one experiences in a day improves your health and well-being, but also your metabolism, which eventually reduces metabolic diseases. For those who have taken your building technology courses, this should be very familiar. This is the ASHRAE psychometric chart, which typically is taught in terms of highlighting the comfort zone. Comfort in itself, the term comfort is highly subjective. It's based both on gender and on culture. But we focus on the blue zone, which we call the comfort threshold, and less so on the comfort zone itself, because what we're trying to do is to passively cool the air around the building. If you can do that, then the interior air will need less heating in the winter and less air conditioning in the summer. And in the spring and the fall, it makes these thresholds more comfortable to spend time. We call this the architecture of a threshold, which is both indoor and outdoor, public and private, and city and room. This is the table of contents of our book. This book has a structure, not unlike a building. It also has the structure of our practice, where we work in various modes with environmental and urban research, client-based design projects, pro bono design advocacy, writings, conversations. We begin the book with a glossary, the lexicon of terms. We end it with a foreword without the E. And there are three concepts for indoor urbanism: the public floor, the incomplete whole, and second nature. These concepts, sometimes these concepts lead to research that will precede design, and at times vice versa. The concepts are tested in 3 cities, as mentioned by Ashley. The public floor is based in New York, where MODU has been for the past 12 years. Incomplete Whole is based in Rome, where Kelly and I lived for a year as Rome Prize Fellows. And Second Nature is based in Tokyo, where we lived for some time and found a very culturally specific relationship between architecture and the environment. So I'll start with public flora, the first concept. Public flora is about borders and reimagining a more open city and architecture with less walls. It's also about the ground floor of the city, where we shift the perception of the city from its vertical character to its horizontal character. And I'll start with Horizontal City, which is a research project, and a representation project. The research began by walking the city, where everyone in our studio would walk 12 neighborhoods across the 5 boroughs, documenting the city's open spaces and its microclimates. We would end up always meeting up for dim sum, for lunch, which is an important part of that journey. Eventually, the research led us to focus on the sidewalk as one of the city's most important public spaces. It is over 12,000 miles long, and it has the multiple thresholds between indoor, outdoor, and public and private. And you can see some of the images, on the top middle, the flower shop that put out all their plants into the sidewalk, kind of creating both a kind of like a shared garden that you would walk in between, or in the middle bottom, a ping pong table is set out in front of a restaurant for people to burn calories before they picked up their takeout orders. This is the legend for what eventually would become the drawings. The legend is really about rendering visible these everyday microclimates that one experiences, but imagining it as a more open city in which these thresholds become open spaces. So we were drawing a lot of the invisible properties of the city, the shade from buildings, the parks, the shade from trees, small urban structures such as bus shelters, outdoor dining structures that were built during COVID. And it's an idea about this as a public floor. And a lot of the research was really about not just the shade, but actually the shade inequities that are existing throughout the city. We reimagined this public floor as a continuous experience between indoor and outdoor, that the buildings cast shades, but without their walls. And we found that there's 2 microclimates, one in the street and sidewalk, the other in the rear yards. By doing so, we kind of reimagined New York as this kind of continuous experience of a ground floor, a public floor that has less boundaries. Neighborhoods in New York that have higher per capita income have more shade. So between Brooklyn Heights on the left, and Eastchester Bronx on the right, there can be as much as a 30-degree difference in the surface temperature of the sidewalk between these 2 neighborhoods. Shade should be a public right, not a public amenity. And the term air rights is more than a development term, but it's actually a way to speak about the commons. Trees cover about 20% of New York's public floor. Many of them are on the sidewalk. And the neighborhood with the least trees have the highest heat vulnerability index. For example, Eastchester Gardens in the Bronx, which here is a drawing of the public housing project, where there's ample shade within the boundaries of the project, but it's separated from the city with fences. So there's actually very few trees as you walk along the sidewalk, which those trees are the ones that would be accessible to everyone. It's pretty well known the environmental benefits of trees. They facilitate air filtration, they increase biodiversity. Social benefits are improving health and reducing heat stress. Here in Roosevelt Avenue in Queens, there are very few sidewalk trees, but the shade is provided by the overpass of a sidewalk, of a subway. And that gets us to our other point, which is that while we are big proponents of having more trees in cities, it should be an architectural question as well. Can the built environment provide more microclimates in our urban thresholds, especially for underprivileged communities that are lacking shade from trees? All drawings and representations are forms of translation, and that these are part of them. These are drawings we would use data from GIS, also from thermal imaging, and we would translate them into what we call thermodynamic drawings. We're designing for and with the microclimates, so we need to render them first. And this is about really the thresholds of the in-between, so in between the environment and bodies, in between architecture and the city. This horizontal city envisions a more climatically diverse, more adaptable to changing climates, and more resilient to extreme weather, but very importantly, more accessible architecture for many. This project was a project that we did in Holon for the Holon Design Museum. It's an installation, a public installation, and so I'll just speak a little bit. The installations and exhibits for us have been a form of built research. We're lucky if we break even with these kind of projects, but they allow us to test ideas, and then from one installation to another, the ideas develop and they become formalized. Much of the ideas in these projects is about atmospheres, designing with atmospheres, and understanding atmospheres as both environmentally or atmospheres as potentials for environmental and social dynamics. And so further installations are about rendering the invisible, and so we've worked with wind, we've worked with dust, artificial dust, which that's a different story. We've worked with air pollution and different cultural institutions and museums. So for this project, we were tasked to revitalize an abandoned plaza. It was empty from the extreme heat and strong solar radiation. It had provided no shade. So as a public space, it was very unsuccessful. But it was the plaza in front of the National Design Museum and with a media tech on the other side. And we were interested that in this part of the world, the Mediterranean breeze, it changes daily with the wind coming in from the sea in the afternoon and then in the morning going back out. So we tried to capture this daily cycle of changing wind and had this idea about a pavilion that would work with not just the shade that changes with sun, but with wind. So there were 30,000 balls of 3 different sizes. And we were really trying to design something that was always incomplete because it was always changing. So some of the scenarios that you see is some of the ways in which we work. These are internal documents where even though we're designing for one project, we reimagine what if this were a building without walls, a bookstore, or a home, and it helps us think through scenarios rather than fixed final outcomes. So there's a mesh ceiling, a kind of suspended mesh ceilings where the balls move in one direction in the morning and move back in the afternoon. So it's especially important in a place like in Holon, where there's a very large Ethiopian immigrant community that lives there. They don't have a lot of access. The public spaces that they have access to often are not comfortable to spend time. So part of the project was actually just trying to create something really simple, which is literally shade, but to do something different with it. We're trying to make this essentially the public space more accessible, and we always said that in this project it always would be incomplete until people and the weather would come and kind of temporarily complete the project. And it was designed as a prototype, and with the idea that the museum was interested in deploying the prototype in multiple plazas around the city. So, when you're doing these projects and you're working remotely, the thing that keeps you up at night is, will they build it totally level? Because if they don't, then we're going to have a big problem with all the balls moving towards one end. So they were able to do that and do it really well. We also kind of worked off the typology of greenhouses that are very common in the desert, basically greenhouses for growing produce. Which led us to this idea of a kind of open-ended, open architecture that has less architectural matter, but it's more an architecture that's really trying to connect people to the environments around them. We collaborated also with the museum and with the media tech for programming activities, because for these projects we're always interested in how people would use it and the unpredictability of when people use it. So there were performances. Public performances that would happen, dance classes that would occur. There was a loan library that would be kind of moved into the plaza and then taken back at night, or quite simply just people playing with a ball. So this is, as I mentioned, these projects are form of built research, and we use it to inform other research. And I think that between this project and the first project I showed, Horizontal City, there's probably 7 years between them, but they kind of feed each other, and they're kind of constantly informing our work. The next concept is incomplete whole. And we're interested in this idea that architecture is always incomplete in a way, that you never, it's never done. And that leads us to a kind of design process of multiple scenarios, thinking through scenarios. So this is a documentary research project that we did when we were in Italy, looking at incomplete structures from the north in Milan all the way down south to Sicily. And we traveled throughout Italy, documenting these modern ruins. Italy has over 600 towns, cities and towns with unfinished public initiated construction projects. There's even a ministry department that is responsible for this legacy of incomplete work, which I always imagine would have a really amazing business card, Minister of Incomplete Work. This is photos of a Calatrava project that you wouldn't find on the internet, but it went. They built up to spend about 400 million euros on it before it went on, before they essentially canceled the project. And when we got access to the site, the project was we were led onto the site by the project's structural engineer, who apparently had been. Going to work for about 7 years, still collecting a paycheck for a project that was totally halted. So in Rome's winter, what we found about these projects, they're kind of an embarrassment for the Italian, or certainly the architecture community. But we wanted to see them in an optimistic way. That we saw these incomplete buildings. They're actually surprisingly comfortable in the climate of Rome. When you can see them and imagine them as open-air buildings, you have the concrete with the thermal mass. So we would start to analyze these quantitatively. Or here, this performance hall that had a capacity, performance capacity for hundreds of people in a very small town in Sicily that had a population of 4,000. So these, typically they're considered, these projects are considered modern ruins, but we would rethink them as weather rooms and indoor cities, and they provided interior weather, and some of these actually became part of our lexicon of terms. So initially we would spend a lot of time trying to get access to these sites, and then we quickly learned that the Italian way was just to find a gap in the fence. This is an incomplete train station outside of Milan by Aldo Rossi. Here we were confronted with this idea of an architect who had his whole body of work was based on ideas of collective memory. But then what do you do with a building of his that doesn't have a memory? Is this open air architecture, or is it a semi-interior landscape, or is it a covered urban plaza? I think that in our vision, it was all of these, and we were trying to reimagine them as a new kind of commons, architectural spaces that would provide more connections to the outdoors. So rather than see them as architecture failures, they're opportunities. We raised questions about the notion of completion. And especially with our societies in which there's so much change, what does it really mean, and when is a project ever really complete? So when we came back to the U.S. with this research, we reimagined it as looking at vacant buildings in post-industrial cities on the East Coast and also in the Midwest. We're looking in Detroit and Pittsburgh, Newburgh, New York. This is an urban map, I believe, of this one of Newburgh, of vacant buildings and lots. Each one is a gap in a community's social fabric. And what can be done to repair these gaps while also focusing on the communities who have been long living there. The renovations and adaptive reuse that would be typical, these are often not possible in these kind of towns or cities. And they're also tools or part of the tools of development, which often comes with gentrification. So we start to ask, is there something new we can do with these vacant buildings? Reimagine their use while also building communities. Reusing them as existing buildings, reusing existing buildings have the most amount of impact is on future carbon emissions because you don't have to demolish and then rebuild. So what we ended up doing is we're trying to work, and we work with community groups where we're designing for communities and their groups. Typically these are groups that can't afford architecture, but also for us, it's a way for us to seek the clients we want to work for rather than wait for clients to come to us. Essentially, it's a proposal about mini buildings within buildings, lightweight modular structures that are seeds to occupy larger buildings, and collaborating with community groups to decide what they need. Who will decide what they need? It's very simple construction, essentially open air structures, but then in certain climates they can be enclosed with panels. And essentially what we're saying is that it's much more feasible to provide off-grid electricity for a 10% mini building than an entire vacant building. So they're enclosed in visually permeable mesh screens that are semi-climatized. Here, for this prototype that we call the line, it expands. You can expand out from it during the spring, summer, and fall. In the winter, you can retract. And basically, trying to design small structures that are both environmentally and socially adaptable. And these are some strategies for one organization we were working with in Detroit. This one is actually an open lot, an outdoor lot. Different strategies where the module can be deployed in different ways for different uses. You know, this is within the practices what we call pro bono design initiatives. We dedicate time towards doing this. Certain percentage of our time is spent on these kind of projects, working on the issues that matter to us. So the last term, or the last concept, is second nature. And second nature for us has two meanings. One, which is another nature, another form of nature in which architecture and environment are hybridized in a way, and kind of represented as one. And the second term, or the second definition, is literally the spatial habits, like things you do by second nature. And you need to unlearn these in order to learn new behaviors as it relates to both architecture and the environment. This project is an addition onto a multifamily residential building in Brooklyn. We're adding a small 10-foot by 20-foot by 50-foot addition in the rear yard. And as we learned from Horizontal City, the rear yards have different microclimates than the streets and sidewalks. It's a small range of indoor-outdoor spaces, which are organized as vertical ecologies, each with their own environment. And as each floor is enlarged, we're adding areas for adaptable growth within the same unit, so you don't have to. It reduces the need for demolition. But what we did was kind of consider the entire addition as a threshold space. We also have this kind of work in our work. We question the more typical ways to think about passive house as solely being super insulated and airtight, but actually that in the temperate seasons, in summer, fall, and spring, that you can have an open air building that in the winter, when you need to heat, you close. So it kind of gives you the benefits of two different ways of thinking about the environment. So if I could return to the idea of the psychometric threshold, the idea of heating, preheating or pre-cooling the air passively around a building in order to both create thresholds to spend time in, but also to reduce energy costs. This is an example of it, and starting from, this is the kind of lowest level, where we're looking essentially at this a question of like, when is a wall not a wall? The envelope here is designed as not a boundary, a separator, but actually as an exchange between the indoor and outdoor environments. The panels, it's a relatively simple metal panel system that we flip or actually rotate so that you can kind of see the seam down the middle. There's two different sides in how the light reflects off it. There are panels that are perforated, so they're used for railings and also for brise-soleil. So we design each floor of the addition to be different because it's kind of like a microecology that's vertical. So the basement has a double height space that has an indoor tree. All the finishes in this area are exterior, so they can be left to be exposed to the outdoors. And the ground floor is a kind of all-weather room. In the winter, it's fully enclosed interior, and then in other seasons, it's an open-air room. These two floors have floor drains so that rain can come in regardless of the, because it drains through the floor. And then there's floors that have multiple doors and windows that get very confusing with how to open and close them all. But the furniture is all exterior furniture. The indoor terrace that's on the left there, it has openings in the wall, but no windows, no glass. So it's both kind of feels interior, but also is an exterior space. And then we use mirrors in the thresholds between the inside and outside to kind of mark this what is new and what is original. The project was complex structurally because of soil issues, but also zoning. It was not built as of right, and we used several important zoning exemptions in order to get the project built. Which leads us to this idea of the title for the project, Mini Tower 1. It's this idea that you have something very small. One of our lexicon terms is smallness within vastness. Things that are small does not necessarily mean that they're not important or consequential at an urban scale, and that you can imagine them when they get repeated, that they can have actually an impact. Which then would lead to this design project that happened after a research project that happened after the design project, in which we looked at the zoning exemptions of the city. We were really interested in the fact that these exemptions are actually what allowed the project to get built. And we started to wonder, is there a way to add housing units to a neighborhood without impacting its social character? Increase density to existing housing. There's a lot of discussion about the missing middle housing right now, which is basically all the housing in between single-family homes and very large apartment or condo complexes. So townhouses, fourplexes, live-work units. And what we were thinking about was often this is spoken about in terms of new construction because many cities have a lot of building stock that is already middle housing. But can we get more out of them rather than thinking about any kind of demolition of them? So in New York, the zoning codes allow for shallow lots, lots that are less deep than the 100 feet that's typical, which when they get more shallow, they actually allow for these rear additions, which is seems contradictory, but it's what the zoning code says. And that made us start thinking about urban imaginary in which there'd be several mini towers within these rear yards, and that even if you just churn off, imagine that the fences are removed, and they could all access this kind of collective rear yard space. So we use GIS to identify all the shallow lots in this map, which is Brooklyn, all the shallow lots that are less than 100 feet deep. And this exemption is allowed for what's called irregular lots by the zoning code. But what became interesting is that they occur frequently enough that they are exemptions rather than that become a rule. And these are the maps of the maps that of all the zoning exemptions for the project combined together, and all the lots in Brooklyn, Queens, that meet these exemptions. This essentially reimagining the project as having an urban scale impact. And this area of Queens shows how urban growth can create conditions in which irregularities become a rule. It also questions the role of conventional land use zoning. really in a city like New York, in the way that it's developed, what is the role of zoning, where the irregularities have more value than as-of-right rules. This project is a project we call Promenade. It's in Houston that we recently completed. It's a mixed-use office and retail development. Houston has extremely hot climate with a lot of rain. These kind of speculative developments, they come with their own challenges. Certainly, there's very limited means in which what you can do. So we focused very specifically on just saying that we're going to try to reduce the use of air conditioning by passively cooling the air around the building, and then also improve outdoor comfort so that people would want to spend more time when it's not summer in Houston, which is, no one wants to spend any time outside. So it really ended up being focusing on the exterior wall, also because it is speculative development. So we first started by taking the wall and kind of pushing some of it at a diagonal from the sidewalk, such that each recessed space would provide these pocket gardens. These pocket gardens with different microclimates. And so the idea is to use 1% of the site to get much more impact than that 1%. These drawings, we're always doing these drawings that we call indoor-outdoor drawings, basically trying to focus on exactly that space in between. And what the design ended up being a series of fins, these vertical fins. It's a west facade, so they provide a lot of shade. There's vertical gardens, there's signage. And what we're trying to create, are these multisensorial environments that are beyond the visual. So shade coming from buildings and landscape, the higher humidity from bamboo groves and climbing plants on the fins. These are some of the views of spaces of the kind of strategies to cool the air around the building, views from the outside and from the inside. So it is a concrete building. The client asked for what's called tilt-up wall construction. It's very economical. It simplifies the construction sequence. But what we're trying to do is also see whether we can do better environmentally. So the concrete we used was a low carbon version of concrete. And then we tested an idea that you see there on the right, where we were doing mock-ups, baking concrete panels in the kitchen, and then documenting it with thermal photography. What we call the self-cooling walls. So this is an example of research that is not prompted, that's not required in a project, but actually is our own initiative, trying to take the needs of a client and make it into design opportunities. So they asked for a wall that's easily maintained, so often using texture or patterns is one good strategy for that. And so we thought we could do something more than just meet that need, and we developed an idea about walls that kind of work like a radiator. They basically have an increased surface area, and that increased surface area, when you combine it with natural breezes, would allow the heat to release faster. We worked with Transolar, the climate engineer we often work with, basically we found that the walls between a flat panel and a corrugated panel is as much as 20-degree difference at the same point in time. So cooling faster than the other. The flat panels are hotter. So we ended up using 2 panel types, and we're basically using them in different areas depending on what we thought were need, but it's also kind of an architectural effect. So we're always trying to do better with our buildings, regardless of whether they're, even when they are concrete, but also if they are steel. Because for us, it's important, regardless of what the building is, that we're always testing these ideas. We do have right now a project in Wyoming that is mass timber, that's clad only using wood and stone. It's both passive house and net zero energy and net zero carbon. It's a much more technologically, let's say, advanced project, but this one is actually, in a way, very simple, but still trying to test new ideas. And here it's an image of one of the back walls, which ends up being one of our favorite walls. That's not paint color, it's the 2 different corrugated patterns. The sun hits it differently, and at a certain time of day, you get this kind of material aesthetic effect connected to an immaterial thermal experience. And the landscape is connected to all of these patterns of the wall. We have the gardens, the pocket gardens, are all local to Texas: rock gardens, tall grasses, pollinator gardens, and desert garden. We would use different panels depending on what the plantings are, trying to create hotter microclimates for certain ecologies. This is the last project. This is a series of conversations that we had in Japan with the architects listed: Fumihiko Maki, Itsuku Hasegawa, Kengo Kuma, Ryu Nishizawa, Takaharu and Yui Tezuka, Go Hasegawa, and Akihisa Hirata. We always find when we're in other cultures, it's really helpful to speak to architects there. So when we were in Japan, Rachely and I had conversations with these architects. This is 7 architects over 5 architectural generations. It's 50 years of architectural culture, from the post-war metabolists to practices that emerged after the 2011 tsunami. And the conversations occurred during a summer in 2018 when we were there, in which there were numerous extreme weather events. There were 2 heat waves, a typhoon, flash floods, and an earthquake. All, one could say, is prompted by changes in climate. And the conversations, each one is organized by a similar set of questions. We would ask the same questions to all of them, and the questions overlap with our own interests. And what became obvious was this idea about horizontal and vertical history in Japanese culture, architecture culture. Architects they're less concerned with architects of their own generation, who they kind of practice with, and much more concerned with and very much connected to the work that precedes them. This idea of, in a way, of a vertical history of kind of continually working on the same project and developing it over and over. So in this example, Fumihiko Maki and Itsuku Hasegawa, who is lesser known outside of Japan, but she would be the generation of Toyo Ito, and Ryu Nishizawa, who is half of Sana. Between them, there's 40 years that separates them, but there's a continuity of projects between testing similar ideas. And these are questions, we asked a question about the border between the inside and outside, and they all answered it in terms of designing space between the buildings and activating them. Maki's idea of collective form, which is now over 50 years old, and open linkages still remain important to the architects today. And both Itsuku Hasegawa and Ryu Nishizawa would answer the question similarly by speaking about the importance of designing for the spaces in between. So a project at the top, like Hillside Terrace by Maki, which is a building at the scale of the city, and Court Decor Yonesaka by Hasegawa, or Moriyama House by Nishizawa. These are projects that are city at the scale of the house. They're all kind of in a conversation with each other. Hillside Terrace by Maki was executed over 30 years with one client built over 6 phases. So in a way, the open linkages that he was interested in grew with time. And he would say that he had a very simple desire, which was just to, in his open linkages, to provide a space for a tree and its shade. This project by Hasegawa was similarly informed by trees. The existing trees were maintained and the building were planned around them, resulting in breaking up the building into smaller volumes in this kind of field organization. And she spoke about fields, literal fields, and an idea of her social desire for architecture that was about freedom. Moriyama House, a project that's pretty well known, a project where you move from the inside to the outside continually, is first a strategy of breaking the building into smaller volumes, but also between urban and architectural, so much so that when you go to visit the house, there's a sign there that asks people not to walk into the house because the way in which it's designed, it's very easy to understand that you are basically the boundary between neighborhood and house is very fluid. So I'm at the end, or perhaps the beginning, and we're looking forward as a practice to continue to learn from what we've done. We're always trying to mobilize both research and design as a form of practice. The design manifests our research, which in turn gives form to our ideas, and our realized work, whether buildings or texts, make visible these ideas. There's one central idea, I think, to our work, which is about Indo-urbanism and whether it can prompt an architecture to be more adaptable and changing to address the climate crisis, while also envisioning better futures. And we've always have argued that the environment is squarely part of the architecture discipline. It just was removed during modernism. But it now involves architecture to be in conversation with other allied disciplines of the built environment, with landscape, with urban design, and with planning. We're trying to connect essentially the quantitative, the data that we use, with the qualitative, which is the design of atmospheres, because I think it's really essential to not always be in crisis mode, always responding to crises, but actually that we're trying to design places for people to spend time, to connect, and not separate, because at the end of the day, the real impact of design is that it's a practice of extreme optimism. Thank you. Do you have a mic? Yeah.
I do.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Which seat? Which
I'll
color?
take this
Do you
one.
want your blue?
Oh yeah.
You can
sure.
do your blue, which is like green. Blue and green,
Yeah, that's true.
right?
All one word.
All one word. Okay. So there's a lot there, and also in the interest of getting the students also to ask some questions or others to ask questions, I think I want to talk about just two things.
Yeah.
So in these three concepts that are all part of indoor urbanism, which is public floor, incomplete whole, and the second nature, and the idea that New York might be the public floor,
Yep.
12 years,
Mm-hmm.
then Rome is kind of the incomplete whole, a year, and then second nature was your trip to Japan, which was 4 months.
Yep.
I want to return to second nature, which may be the smallest amount of time, but seems to have had an outsized impact on your work. And it returns a little bit to this comment that it's not about an environmentalism that's responding or reacting to the crisis, or even just proactive to it, but it's really about the effect as well as the science. And I think that's really, really important. And you highlighted in second nature very briefly, but I think it's brilliant, the idea that second nature is two things. One is second nature is a way of behaving where we don't think about it anymore. It's built up on practices that may be very historical. Yet at the time, second nature is in contrast to first nature, which you call the primordial nature. And that the second nature now is a way of not, and I think it's very Eastern, right? Or let me say actually very Japanese, to be very specific, in which it's not so much harmony between, but merging of both.
Yeah.
And do you know the work of of Otsu, his films?
No.
Okay, so this very, very, very important Japanese in 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so he has one film which is called Floating Weeds. This was 1959, I think. And why I bring it up is because in his films, nature is a protagonist that operates with the actual characters as both part of the narrative and spatial environment for the narrative. So in Floating Weeds, it's really, really beautiful if you see it. There's first a scene with a window and a roof that's outside, and it's just raining, it's pouring, it's a sheet of rain. And then it switches to a scene where you're under an in-between space, a porch, and the rain is sheeting down, and then and then it moves to two of these looking at each other, and a man and a woman are having an argument. Lovers are having an argument with these sheets of rain. So the rain is part of it. It's not just a context or environment, it is a protagonist. He has another one, very famous vase scene. 10 seconds it focuses on a vase on a low table with a translucent screen and just the wind moving the leaves behind. So, absolutely amazing sensibility, which is about overlapping spaces, nature as blended in with human action, and not a kind of just harmony, but a blending of the two. I really wish you had shown the Yosemite, the Jackson Hole project. Maybe you could talk about a little bit with those as a prompt, because there's the overlapping space, there's the bringing of the phenomena of nature in, the climate in, the cold, the hot, the tub, different parts of it as well. Because I think your work is very much of that sensibility,
Yeah.
even though it's it may have been the shorter amount of time you spent.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Anne. Okay, maybe I'll touch a little bit on the importance of the Japanese conversations for us. It's work that we constantly go back to. And before we went to Japan, we were always interested in the work, but we found that the way in which nature or the environment is spoken of, it seemed almost overly simplified, right? And that when we actually went there and saw the projects and we spoke to the architects, it's simplified because it's been so distilled to a kind of essential character or essential identity. And I think that's something that we really take a lot with our work, is this idea that to try to see the architecture as not having too much of we're trying not to make the architecture its own identity, but actually an identity that comes with its relationship to its surroundings. And I think that's where the project in Jackson Hole, which is a nature observatory, where we were very fortunate to also be involved in the site selection. So we ended up looking, because we're always thinking about the in-between, we looked for a site that's in between, so it's basically between a meadow and between the woods, so it's sited exactly at that intersection. And then the design of it is really about a series of interstitial spaces in which no one space takes priority, but it's always the transition from one to the other. But that project allowed us, and I didn't talk too much about it, but collaborations are super important to us. And so we worked with an animal sociologist, which I never knew one existed. So a sociologist who specializes on human, non-human interaction. So for a nature observatory, we're trying to design a project in which wildlife you could have a kind of immersive experience. And what we found was that, what we learned was that you first start with something very simple and very small. It's all scales of scales, right? This is the conversation we had. That you start with a pollinator garden. So with the birds and the bees in the garden, then comes the rabbits and the foxes, and then the larger animals, the elk, the moose, and then hopefully not the big grizzly bear. But that was a way for us to think about the architecture as well, like a kind of scaling up from very simple elements of like wildlife blinds that are essentially slatted wood to the scale of the site, which is a very large site. Yeah.
But you also have, you have these diagrams where you're showing interlocking, literally interlocking rectangles where the intersection of it becomes this room that has, it's meant to be a hot tub in the winter. It has, so the whole thing changes. It's temperature. And then there's also the overlap between the interior and exterior space. So there's a really breaking down of borders and blending from space to, so it's not a sequence. Space to space, but it's a blend, right? Which I think is.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, if you were to take two rectangles and overlap them, the rectangle that's a result of that overlap is a space that can be used for all seasons, but it's also counts as interior space, and that's, I think, for us, it's also an idea about energy. Like, we reduced a third of the need for energy by making that space partially climatized, essentially. But yeah, I mean, I think all these things, the kind of metrics of energy and the experiences and the atmospheres for us, we're all trying to connect them together.
Yeah. And it really, what I also find fascinating is that there is no separation between technical material innovation, your corrugated wall, and spatial innovation. And so too often in environmentalism, the pragmatic is the drive,
Yep.
and anything else is extra.
Yep.
Whereas for you, it's not extra. The two are absolutely intricately
Yeah.
entangled with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I always think that it probably came from my own training, that I learned a lot of these things in my first job out of grad school. I worked at Michael Hopkins' office in London, where I learned a lot of the environmental ideas, but I found that there was not a kind of aesthetic idea, and that it needs to have both. I think that without both, then you just have, it's like trying to convince people to behave better without the upside of why you would want to do that.
The desire.
Yes, the
to do
desire
better.
and essentially the emotional connection, which is something that we talk about a lot, like emotion with metrics, which are two things that typically don't come together.
So one other question or curiosity, which is not dissimilar, because again, it's a situation in which it doesn't seem to be either or, but both and.
Yeah.
I want to understand how you and Rachely work together, because often partnerships, there is the person who's more into the theory or the research, and the person who's more, let's get this thing built, and it doesn't necessarily fall along a gender line.
No,
right?
yeah.
But in yours, there seems to be a constant back and forth between research, technological modeling, et cetera, and I'd love to know how the two of you work together.
I think the lexicon would be the best way to speak about it, right? Like we, coming from two different cultures, two different backgrounds, misinterpretations is the rule rather than the exception. And we find ourselves discussing, and I think that's how the lexicon came to be. It was this project of 12 years that when we finally wrote down all the terms, we understood that we need to celebrate our differences in how we can look at the same thing. It makes for, I think, typically a very long design process, because you have to speak for a long time before you arrive at that. But I don't know if it's so much that one of us does one thing and one of, I think that as with a lot of partnerships that are couples, which we are, they basically, both of us are very passionate about design, and that is where probably not the most financially sound decision, but we start always with design. And then at different points, we kind of find different interests in the work.
And you both work on the technical and on the spatial and the modeling and the drawing and the representation. And is it really a kind of blended?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So, questions from the floor? None? Or you're just hungry?
Andrew.
So I have a question about the mini tower. It seems like an interesting townhouse take on an ADU or urban setting. And if that gets any traction in New York, which is already a big density.
I missed the last sentence.
It gets traction.
So the potential way for it to get traction in a city like Columbus is to increase density in a city that's de-densifying at the same time that it's growing.
Yep.
I'm wondering what the argument to do the mini towers in New York is.
I mean, I think that for us, it's about not always relying on a cycle of demolition and construction. That it's about increasing density, but also to do it almost invisibly. You can't see them, despite the name. You can't see it. It's only in certain angles can you see it. So like kind of imagining that you can do all these things in the rear yards of the city, which in a way that's very New York, right? Like there's a whole world in New York that's the rooftops. That is separate from what happens on the street, and also is a space of privilege. But in this case, we see it as like, we can do these things in neighborhoods where smaller, more kind of precise interventions or additions can keep the character of a neighborhood.
I think there are also spatial possibilities with the mini tower that don't really exist with ADUs, which are kind of just like mini houses.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the way that you were using it, they were
Yeah.
making spaces that don't exist in the existing townhouses.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I do somehow imagine if there was something in between an ADU and the mini tower, like that you could do an ADU type configuration on some floors, but then not on others. Like I think that would be the most powerful way to deploy the strategy.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Phu,
Thank you.
showing us your
Thanks.
work. The other house that I like very much are the double towers.